Hey guys, Caleb here from CDBS Studios, and I am currently on a huge Road to Doomsday rewatch. And as many of you might know by now, I have been doing multiple rankings throughout my journey in order just to catalog some of the smaller portions of what I call the Marvel Cinematic Multiverse, as we've talked about many things, including many MCU phases already, the Defenders saga, and some of the outside Marvel projects. But today we are continuing my Road to Doomsday rewatch with the mainline MCU, specifically Phase 2. Now, Phase 2 is definitely one of the black sheeps of the MCU because it's not the origins phase that Phase 1 is, or the peak phase that Phase 3 was, and then whatever you want to call Phase 4 and Phase 5, as there are some really solid, excellent projects here in Phase 2, and there's also a fair share of stinkers as well, unfortunately. So, without further ado, today I'm going to rank the 6 MCU films that are a part of Phase 2. Now, much like I did for the Phase 1 video, I know that technically some of the MCU one-shots, some of the TV shows started airing in this time, but for the sake of simplicity, they aren't usually included in Phase 2, and it's just the 6 movies. So that is what I'm going to be ranking in today's video, the 6 MCU movies from Iron Man 3 up to Ant-Man. And if these MCU videos do well enough, maybe we can talk about potentially doing Marvel one-shot ranking or talking about some of the TV shows I haven't talked about yet. But with all that preamble out of the way, let's jump into the ranking and rank the 6 projects in Phase 2 of the MCU. Alright, let's cut the crap. You guys know exactly what film is in the last place spot. It's Thor the Dark World. Yeah, I'm pretty sure most of you went into this video probably expecting this to be last place, because for all intents and purposes, yeah, Thor the Dark World is pretty easily the weakest film here in Phase 2. And it's not entirely the filmmaker's fault, as if you actually look up in some of the interviews and that, you'll find that the original plan for Thor the Dark World was originally going to have Hela as the main villain, and it was going to be kind of like this Romeo and Juliet inspired story, but set in space. But then the creatives, the higher up creative committee at Marvel, just looked at each other and said, we're not going to do that because we don't think Hela would sell enough toys. So as a result, we got one of the most boring MCU films to date, because basically all the ideas the writers had basically got scrapped. And after seeing how good Thor Ragnarok is, I just want to ask, how many Malekith toys did you guys end up selling, Marvel Studios? Because, yeah, I've gone on the record to say this before, but I soul-heartedly believe Malekith to be one of the worst MCU villains, maybe even my least favorite of all time. Well, not my least favorite, because Todd Phelps from Hulk King from She-Hulk exists, but he's definitely in the bottom 2, because Malekith is just so boring of an antagonist. He's just basically the basic premise of he wants to destroy simply because he can. There's no ulterior motives, there's no extra things he goes through. It's just he wants to use the magical aether to corrupt the 9 realms during the convergence just because he can. And that's all he is. There's no nuance, no subtlety. He is easily one of the most boring MCU villains to date, and I genuinely hate watching him every time I go through this movie again. On some other notes, we also have some elements of quality, I will admit, in this movie, as this movie does decide to actually promote Asgard back to being the full focus of the film after the first film kind of basically shafted Asgard to basically have the characters get stranded in New Mexico for the entire film, while this time it's fully centered on Asgard. So we actually are sidelining characters like Dr. Selvig and Darcy in that, and instead we're focusing specifically on Thor, Jane, the Warriors 3, Sif, Loki. And I think it leads to a film that I think I enjoy a little bit more in that sense, where we actually get to know a little bit about these characters that we kind of didn't spend enough time with in the first film, in my opinion. Thor also goes through an interesting arc in this movie as he starts to grapple with the fact that he might become king or might not become king, and it's kind of fun to see that internal struggle that leads to a great ending. But by far the best character in this movie is far and away Loki, as this is the prime example of why Marvel kind of screwed up by always kind of killing off their main villains in the films they introduced them in, because like Loki, we already have had him for 2 films at this point through the first Thor film and the Avengers. And this film is the turning point where Loki starts to go from the true antagonist to being a kind of anti-hero, kind of redemptive character, where we open the film with him going and getting sentenced to the Asgard dungeons, much like getting sentenced to the Asgard dungeons, following up on his crimes in the first Thor film and Avengers. And then halfway through this movie, you get an absolutely gut punch of a death scene in the form of Frigga, who has a great funeral scene. The entire moment where she dies is a well-written moment. And this is the moment where Loki finally turns into somewhat of an ally, as you get to see that he's not a bad guy at heart. And it's so fun to watch that dynamic as with Thor, especially after Thor breaks Loki out and the two of them work together to try to take down Malekith. It is such a well-written redemption arc, and it gets just better from here in the later Thor films, and this is the film I like to attribute it to. But at the end of the day, this movie is just, the reason it's last place in this ranking is just, it's so boring. I mean, the story is so simple, as basically the entire premise is that the convergence is coming, where the 9 realms will become in alignment, and it's starting to open rifts in the realms, and Jane randomly falls through one and gets infected by the ancient ether that Malekith needs to destroy the 9 realms, and so it's like a power play over Jane, basically, for the whole film. And then it's basically just, that's the whole premise. It's pretty boring in most of the fight sequences and most of the action sequences. Literally, the final battle of the film is basically unwatchable because of the fact they felt the need to put this red filter on it. And this movie needed more time in the writer's room. And if they wished, I wish they could have just done the story they did, because especially seeing how good Thor Ragnarok turned out, then I feel like we would have had a good Thor film on our hands if we could have had the Hela plotline they were gonna go with. But as it stands, this is easily the weakest film in Phase 2, but again, much like I said in the last video, this is still not my least favorite MCU project. I mean, it was for a long time, but now that we have some unfortunate stuff in Phase 4 that is unfortunately even worse, this is not the worst MCU project anymore, but it's still definitely the worst project to come out of Phase 2 of the MCU. Next up, I have Avengers Age of Ultron. By far my least favorite Avengers movie so far in the MCU, and also one of the weaker MCU films in my personal opinion. One of the problems that I always find I go into Age of Ultron with is the fact that it really hardcore feels like the movie is more set on setting up all of these future stories that Marvel wanted to tell, instead of just being a good one-off story. Because almost every other MCU movie falls into a category where it's a good single story, but it still leaves room for more stories to be told. This movie is the complete opposite, because we have so many moments in this where they're just artificially trying to create the spin-offs and future stories they want to tell, instead of those naturally falling into place, because they randomly introduce a Natasha Romanoff and Bruce Banner love story just so that they can artificially have Hulk fly off at the end so they could do a Planet Hulk story. They artificially bring in Vibranium and the Maximoff twins so they could potentially do mutants and Wakanda. They have a random subplot where Thor and Eric Selvig go to this cave so Thor can examine a vision, which goes into depth for him on the Infinity Stone, so that they could set up a new Thor film, and could also be like, hey, the Infinity Stones we've been setting up all phase, these are the 4 we've set up. You understand that now, right? And it's so much at the sake of a good story, because it feels like every time we finally get the plot of this movie into motion, we're suddenly grinding to a halt so that the movie can be like, all right, here's a future MCU movie we want to tell. Here's the setup for it. When it's just like in the other movies, it was like, hey, we have this random one-off MacGuffin we used in a movie. Why don't we bring it back for this movie? Or there's a character arc we left open in this film. Let's answer it here instead of those naturally happening in this film. Overall, though, this movie does still have a lot of positives. I do appreciate that one of the issues I argued against the original Avengers film in my Phase 1 video is the fact that it kind of felt like they wrote that film with the weird understanding of you might have not watched everything else in the MCU, so let's reestablish all the main characters before doing the team up when the movie should have just been a basic crossover in my opinion. But this movie goes into it knowing, all right, you already know who the Avengers are, so we're just going to fully delve into the story. And I like that so much better, as it really just feel like the movie just knows, all right, you already know who everybody is. We don't need to spend the entire first 30 minutes introducing everybody. Let's just jump straight into the story, which I think really helps the pacing of this movie. Also, you have some great action in this movie. I, of course, love the opening fight sequence where they storm the castle with the 6 Avengers. That's a great opener fight sequence that perfectly establishes kind of what the film is going to be about. You have great fight sequences, especially the ending one in Sokovia, where all the Avengers team up to go against the Ultron bots. Is so awesome. And also you have the epic Hulk versus Hulkbuster fight, which is probably one of my favorite Marvel fight sequences of all time. It is so good. But all of this also, again, comes at the expense of the villain. Ultron in the comics is one of the best Marvel antagonists, basically being what Magneto is to the X-Men to the Avengers. And this, you could honestly do an entire MCU saga just on Ultron alone. But this movie kind of turns Ultron into this weird character that they could do in one film when he really probably should have stuck around a little longer, which makes me a little excited for Vision Quest. Like maybe we can finally get some more Ultron happily. But the entire premise of Ultron in this movie is that Tony wants to create his programming to be kind of the next level of the Avengers so that the Avengers aren't needed, but because of his paranoia and all that carrying over from Iron Man 3. But then Ultron basically just looks at the internet for 30 seconds, realizes the only way for humanity to be safe is to kill everybody, and then that's the entire premise for him turning evil, when his reason for turning evil in the comics is way more justified and way more interesting. Overall, this is definitely not a bad movie in the slightest. It does also introduce us to some brand new Avengers who I love. We, of course, get introduced to the Maximoff twins, which I really wish Quicksilver could have stuck around for more movies, but I understand the Fox deal. But we, of course, got Wanda here, and she is pretty cool. We got Vision, who is an awesome character, and we even got some more development for certain characters that kind of needed it in a sense, like Hawkeye. Like, I can't believe Jeremy Renner wanted them to kill him off after the first Avengers, but I'm so happy they kind of upped his role in this film so that we could keep him around because he's so good and deserves to stick around. But other than that, Avengers Age of Ultron is one that I always struggled with because, like, the plot is so all over the place and it really takes away from the fun that I otherwise would have with this movie. But at the same time, it does still have way more quality elements, and it's definitely the movie I would much rather rewatch than Thor the Dark World, so it deserves to rank above that film, but I don't think it deserves to go any higher, because I just think I enjoyed the other things in this phase a little bit more than the Avengers movie, which realistically probably shouldn't be the case. Now we have Iron Man 3, the final film in the Iron Man trilogy, which seems kind of shocking to me that they finished the Iron Man trilogy at the beginning of Phase 3 when you really probably should have made more Iron Man films after this. But anyway, Iron Man 3 is definitely a movie that a lot of people have turned on over the years, and it's definitely still got its issues, but it's still got a lot of enjoyable elements. First off, I do really love Tony's arc in this movie, being the story of how he kind of has PTSD from slowly going from this simple guy who was just fighting normal crime to going to literally being an Avenger, him having all that PTSD, knowing that there's more stuff out there, is a really cool concept about how he's trying to build more suits to protect his friends and family, and it's taking over his entire soul and psyche, and it makes for a really interesting story, especially later in the movie when Tony loses everything and gets stranded in the Arctic and basically has to learned kind of self-worth again, especially being surrounded by Harley Keener, who's a really fun kid, and I kind of wish he was in more Iron Man films, much like I feel like for Short Round for Indiana Jones, but whatever, it's fun. And I do really love, of course, the final battle is a pretty cool sequence. Having the house party protocol with all the suits is fun. I love that they did more with the Iron Man suits in this movie because they kind of have felt a little bit like just suits in the previous films, but now they feel like a little like characters, which I like. And overall, this is a pretty fun movie, but it still unfortunately has its issues. One of the biggest issues that I know so many people have with this movie is the Mandarin twist. Now, I do not hate the Mandarin twist as much as everybody else does. I think there's something interesting in the concept of let's introduce this larger than life terrorist who is basically on TV, basically antagonizing the public with all of these explosions and all this other stuff and shooting public figures on live TV. And you build up this really cool twist, this really cool Mandarin villain who is connected to the Ten Rings, which we saw in the first Iron Man movie. And then you reveal he's just an actor, that he's a mouthpiece for the real villain of the movie, who is just being used to cover up the explosions from the experiments that the villain is doing. And they like the concept there, especially because Ben Kingsley makes the Mandarin and Trevor Slattery such an interesting figure. And also watching this movie again post Wonder Man is also very interesting because you get a little bit more seen into the psyche of, because in that show we get a little bit more into the psyche of Trevor Slattery at the time of this movie, which was fun. My issue with that twist was never what the twist was. It's the fact that after the Mandarin gets disposed of midway through this movie, the movie doesn't have a compelling villain to replace him with. Because you spend like the first half of this film building up the Mandarin as this cool, epic villain that Iron Man is going to have to take down. And then when you find out it's not him, we find out that the real villain is Aldrich Killian, who is just using this extremis tech on the side on people, and he's just not interesting. Like, his entire motivation is the fact that he wanted to pitch a concept for a business to Tony Stark, but then Tony Stark blew him off, so now he's mad at Tony Stark and wants to kill him, which is the exact same villain plotline they do for way better characters like Syndrome from The Incredibles, for instance, which is just like, so I just don't find this character interesting at all. And the extremists, they never go forward to explain too much about what it is and what it can do, because like they have concepts of that in the movie, but it like feels like it's just like a super soldier serum times 3 again. And he gives it to Pepper Potts as kind of a way of torture when it just gives her powers, which then the movie complete then the rest of the MCU completely forgot about that. So that's kind of great. And overall, I don't hate the Mandarin twist. It's just that the movie never replaces the Mandarin with a more interesting villain that really feels like that it was worth saving him till the end. Like, it's so annoying. And my other big issue with this movie is, I know I praised Tony Stark's arc, but this movie's ending always feels off to me, because if you didn't know, the end of this movie features Tony Stark destroying all of his Iron Man suits, getting the arc reactor removed, and basically him saying, I'm going to be done being Iron Man, basically. And the reason for that was because when this movie was being made, there was some background stuff where they weren't sure if Robert Downey Jr. was going to be continuing as Iron Man. And so they wrote this movie in a way where it could be the finale to the Iron Man character in the MCU. Of course, this wasn't the finale to the Iron Man character, and he kept going on for multiple more years and eventually got an even better ending to his character in Endgame. So this movie's ending feels all the more off to me on a rewatch. And overall, also, I'm not huge on Rhodey in this movie with the whole Iron Patriot rebrand. He kind of is going more military mode this movie than the previous two, and then eventually he switches up near the end when he finds out the military was hacked. But yeah, this movie's fine and it has its moments, but definitely it has its problems that also weigh it down from being in my top half of the MCU Phase 2 ranking. So, sorry, Iron Man 3. And now on to the MCU Phase 2 movies that I actually like. And we start this list of 3 off with Ant-Man. Now, I really enjoy this movie. The concepts that I loved that the MCU did, which I really feel like DC should have taken some notes from, is the fact that the MCU didn't make superhero movies. They made specific stylized films that just superheroes worked in. So they have political thrillers for Captain America, and they made high school movies for Spider-Man. For Ant-Man, they made a heist movie, and I love heist movies, so I love to rewatch Ant-Man. And yes, is it embarrassing that Ant-Man doesn't get to be a founding member of the Avengers? Sure. Is it a shame that we skip over Hank and Janet just to go straight to Scott and Hope? Maybe. But at the end of the day, this is still a really enjoyable movie, and it has such a fun job. I love seeing Paul Rudd play Scott Lang. He is such a fun character, and it makes for such an enjoyable performance and, of course, enjoyable movie. I, of course, love the overall style of it being a heist movie. We get introduced to a fun crew in the form of the ex-cons. Of course, I love Luis. Who doesn't? We get introduced to Hank, who gets to be a fun mentor to Scott, as they're both kind of fathers who lost their children, which I think is a great way to anchor the film's emotions. I love Hope and kind of how she goes from this stern authority figure to a kind of mentor figure. And of course, the heist itself is very bombastic, as they went full on the what if a guy could shrink, and they went full on to what if a guy could shrink. He had an army of ants, and he just chose to use that to infiltrate a place and steal something, which overall, all great. But, and this is the crucial but, this movie, I've always found I tend to kind of not really, it's not like I don't enjoy it, don't get me wrong, but the ending, I feel like, devolves back into traditional superhero movie and not the heist movie I've been watching for the whole runtime. Because after the heist gets complete, the villain puts on the yellow jacket suit that the main characters were trying to steal, and then goes after Scott's daughter. So he chooses to go after him as well and fight him, and they end up fighting on this miniature Thomas the Train set, which of course to them is big and bombastic, and then they keep cutting away to show how small the battle really is, which is funny, and I like it, but it does really feel like a more superhero-y thing rather than a heist movie thing, and it really kind of kills the tone. Even the villain in general, I kind of am not huge on, because he's basically just Obadiah Stane again, basically just being the mentor to one of our main characters. He runs the business now, and then when he finds out about the tech the main character created, he goes mad and tries to use it for evil means, and the main character has to fight him. And we already did it with Obadiah Stane, and the main villain here is none of the interesting presence that Jeff Bridges does, so I don't enjoy it that much. But other than those things, I still love Ant-Man. It is a bombastic, fun, amazing movie, and it just isn't as strong as the other 2 movies in this phase that we still haven't talked about. So this is where, unfortunately, Ant-Man has to fall. But don't get me wrong, I still love Ant-Man, and this is by far one of my favorite MCU films. It is just that fun and that good. And our runner-up for my favorite MCU Phase 2 film is gonna go to Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Whoa, 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 guys, put down your pitchforks. Let me explain real quick. Captain America: The Winter Soldier is a phenomenal film that has so many moments that are great. First off, the action. This movie has some of the best MCU fight sequences, and it's easy to see why, as you have that initial fight sequence between the Winter Soldier and Captain America where there's a full knife combat, and it's so fun and lively. Of course, this film introduces us to Falcon, so we get to have some amazing aerial dogfights. There's, of course, the amazing car chase sequence between Nick Fury and the Winter Soldier. That's great. We, of course, have the awesome elevator sequence that is so iconic and so amazing. And overall, it makes for such a fun film in the action. Even the final battle between Steve and the Winter Soldier is so great in the helicarriers, and it makes for such an awesome film in the action department. And then when it comes to the story itself, it's also got a great story. Having this whole idea that what if Captain America's efforts back in the 40s didn't solve anything? Hydra still managed to grow and spread and slowly infect S.H.I.E.L.D. until everything they could control. Robert Redford plays such an amazing villain, and I love the scenes he shares, especially with Nick Fury. And then, of course, you also have the Winter Soldier, which I love the initial terror this character inflicts, being this force that you are led to be afraid of through Black Widow's story and just the threat he poses. And then the mask gets ripped off, and you find out that it's a tortured Bucky Barnes. And it adds such a layer to that character, being instead of just being this anti-force that we are supposed to fear, suddenly it's the best friend we spent the last half movie with. And it makes for such a more interesting villain. And I love the Winter Soldier after that reveal. It's such a fun thing as you start to see him slowly break down and want to break free of his programming. And he can't until Steve actually lets him. And it allows to go for an amazing arc for the third installment in the Captain America trilogy that we will cover in my Phase 3 ranking that I know I'm going to eventually make. Overall, I still love the Winter Soldier. It's great. And I haven't even mentioned Falcon yet. Falcon makes for such a fun sidekick to Steve in this movie, being a fun kind of reflection of his character and being fun. Of course, we get to see more of Black Widow in this movie, which is always a fun time, although I kind of wish that Hawkeye could have been here too, so that we could have maybe gotten some more development for him, but that's besides the point. This is a phenomenal movie, but, and here's the crucial but, why it's not first place, you might ask. Well, here's the main thing that I always have to say when I watch this movie. I am not a super fan of political thrillers. And that unfortunate bias leaks into this movie where I find myself not as interested in the political debates and scenes in this movie. I just don't find myself into them. And it means that when the film's not doing bombastic action, I find myself really bored. And I know that might just be a me problem, and I get that, and it's totally understandable. If you told me this was your favorite MCU movie, I wouldn't even argue with you, but it's just a movie that I'm not huge on political thrillers, so if I had the entire MCU catalog in front of me, this is not the one I'm always going to, and even in Phase 2, there's another film I always am going to. But other than that, Captain America and the Winter Soldier is nothing to scoff at. It is a phenomenal movie. It is so fun. It's just unfortunately not the movie I want to rewatch the most out of the MCU. So that's why it doesn't rank any higher, unfortunately. The MCU Phase 2 movie that I actually always keep coming back to rewatch, and the one that is my winner as my favorite film in Phase 2, of course, goes to Guardians of the Galaxy. This movie is everything I want out of a modern superhero movie, and then some. And it's surprising to me that this movie is so good, because the Guardians of the Galaxy were basically these Z-tier Marvel team. They were these characters that almost very little people cared about. But James Gunn came in and found a way to tell a story that not only respected these characters and turned them into cinematic icons, but also found a way to make them characters people related to. As we took this band of misfits, more or less, and found a way to find humanity in each and every member to bring out the specific things that make them interesting. Drax in this movie can be a laughable, funny goofball, but he has that emotionally resonant heart about how Ronan the Accuser and Thanos killed his entire family, and he is thirsty for revenge. And that revenge finds a way to corrupt him to the point where he calls Ronan to the place they're hiding so he can fight him. We are able to drag out Rocket's humanity as he sees himself as a little monster freak that was built up in a lab. Groot is an innocent man that you never want to see get hurt, but he is the one they choose to have die at the end. You have the actual abuse that Gamora went through with Thanos, and of course you have the emotional turmoil of Peter's loss of his mother. And all of it comes together to showcase this great arc of that these people have been fine living on their own all these years, but once they find each other, they realize they needed each other more than they ever could have realized. And it's such a great moment. And then, of course, you have the great action, that final fight sequence with the Nova Corps and the Guardians and the Ravengers versus Ronin. It's such a cool action set piece. I love Yondu in this film, especially after what they did with him in Guardians Volume 2. I love what they do with him here in this movie, even more enjoyable, and it makes for such a great moment. The music is obviously all great. James Gunn knows how to pick perfect soundtracks, and this is obviously one of my favorite soundtracks of all time. I have so many of these songs saved. Even the opening scene alone of this movie is one of my favorite MCU scenes of all time. Like, genuinely, if I was to rank the MCU opening scenes, the Guardians 1 opening scene might be either near the top or number 1, because that's how much I love it. The only things negative I could even say about this movie, which would honestly say if I was doing an overall ranking why I wouldn't put this as my favorite MCU film, is the fact that Ronan is not the most interesting of villains. He is kind of just a tyrant who is mad about the Kree Nova Corps truce and just wants to kill Xandar with an Infinity Stone, which isn't an interesting motivation per se. I find myself way more interested in Nebula's storyline than I do with Ronan, so that's unfortunate. And also, I do find a little bit on certain rewatches that this movie alone, in a way, is a little bit trying to be tied to the rest of the MCU with things like the Infinity Stone setup and all that. So, this movie definitely is not my favorite MCU movie overall, but it's definitely by far my favorite movie in Phase 2. And if I had the whole catalog sitting in front of me, this is easily the Phase 2 film that I immediately am gravitating towards, and the one that I am the most eager to rewatch. And it leads to a movie that is my favorite movie in Phase 2. So there you guys have it. My ranking for all Phase 2 MCU films. If you guys liked the video, then please feel free to subscribe and like the video so that you don't miss my future Road to Doomsday rewatch rankings. And I want to know, if you want to take the chance of ranking all Phase 2 of the MCU, leave your rankings down in the comments and maybe we can get a conversation going. Without further ado, thank you guys all very much for joining me in this video, and I hope to see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys!